It is like I did update Zoom, and like the buttons are slightly different in some ways. Whatever version I have, like it's even like the text is different. So I think I'm gonna blame that and not my incompetence. So I think
Yeah, no, that
that's fair.
happened to me too. So I'm hoping everything works out for the summer because I have to use Zoom a lot this summer. I'm teaching over the summer, and it's the first time I'm teaching over the summer. And it's like
Oh,
it's U.S. history condensed into like I don't know how many weeks. So
Yeah.
it's gonna be fun.
okay.
Yeah.
Is the
Okay.
summer? Is it the full summer, Varsha, or is it just
No,
like
it's only
their
the set.
sessions?
It's only one of the sessions, and so
Okay.
they're doing reconstruction to the present in like a matter of 2 months, and that doesn't seem smart. I mean, it seems like they will learn a lot, but it also seems like I'm gonna have to do a lot because I have to teach 3 sections, so it's gonna be fun.
Holy smokes! You have 3 sections.
Yeah, I mean the thing is,
Yikes!
they asked me and then they told me, we'll pay you, and I was like, well, yeah, obviously you're gonna pay me, and then like I saw how much, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do that, obviously, of course I'm gonna do that.
That's
So
right.
yeah,
We'll
yeah,
all we'll all sell out. I mean, that's the thing about academics, right?
exactly,
We're all
yeah,
willing to sell out. It's just
Have
we
a
have
price.
very low prices, really. I mean, it's
yeah.
like
Exactly.
bargain basement. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah,
all
so
right.
well, I wanted to everybody seems like everybody's joining, so I just wanted to everyone to say hi to Rachel one more time. Rachel, thanks so much for, setting all this up for us. Rachel's going to be keeping track of the Q&A, so if you are if you're watching, make sure to put your Q&A put your questions in the chat so we can see it, or in the Q&A box. And today our guest is Bathsheba Demuth. She is an assistant professor of history and environment and society at Brown. She's an environmental historian. She specializes in the lands and the seas of the Russian and North American Arctic. So it's the first time we've have an Arctic historian with us. She got her master's and PhD from Berkeley. Go Bears! And her first book is Floating Coast. It's a prize-winning book. It's an amazing book. It's an environmental history of the Bering Strait. And now she's working on a second book about the Yukon River. So I'm excited to talk about that because I'm a big fan of rivers and dams and anything to do with that. So this is going to be great.
I just want to pause you there for a minute there, Varsha, because you said that Bathsheba's was an award-winning book, right? Floating Coast Environmental History of the Bering Strait. But Rachel has prepared us a little cheat sheet, and like that's the list of awards that book won. So it's like award-winning book, like yeah, like
Yeah.
I won like a
Not one
regional
award.
like medieval
Ew.
association book. It's just like a few, but like she's won like 15 awards. So it's a freaking amazing book. And there's a link, which Rachel, if you don't mind, maybe throw that in the chat in a minute. But it's on our bookshelf, so you should go buy it if you haven't. So
Yeah.
but
I mean, this book also made its way into like the layperson's press. Like there are people at like NPR and like New York Times, and they're like, yo, this book is good. So I was like, oh
yeah.
my God.
It's
Now I'm
amazing.
going to spontaneously combust. So it's going to be a very short
I
evening.
think that'll be an exciting episode for
True,
us. So
yeah.
I
Yeah.
encourage you to do that. Maybe not for the best.
I can
of you,
hold
but-
off a little. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. Maybe towards the end or something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I guess our first question, though, of course, Bathsheba, has nothing to do with the book. Is what are you drinking tonight?
So I'm drinking a Negroni with Bar Hill gin. My husband was so excited when I was on this episode because he was like, all right, what is the plan for what you're going to drink? He spent much of the pandemic learning how to bartend for the two of us. So I requested a Negroni because it's very hot and summery here today.
Excellent,
Nice.
wonderful. So,
Nice.
how about you, Rachel? What are you drinking?
I made a French 75.
Oh,
Beautiful.
a classic, like a Prohibition era
Mhm.
cocktail as well.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely delicious. Yes, wonderful. Varsha, what about you?
I am just having scotch. I'm having the Bowmore 15. I picked it up mainly because I finished my bottle of Bowmore 12 a while ago, and the Bowmore 12 was the first fancy bottle I ever bought for myself. And so when I saw this at the store, I was like, time for an upgrade. So, yeah.
Fantastic, excellent. So,
Yeah, how about you, Matt?
So I actually ran earlier, not because of the technical problems I was having earlier, but I ran and got myself some Woodford Reserve Double Oaked, which is some really fantastic, smooth, caramelly bourbon. So I did have an old fashioned with some Uncle Nearest earlier, but I'm now on to the Woodford Double Oaked. So Anyway, so Varsha, do you want to start us off?
Yeah. So we'll say bye to Rachel, I guess. And I think my first question is something that I didn't know. Rachel found this out for us. Bathsheba, you moved to the Yukon from Iowa when you were 18, and you apprenticed under a sled dog musher. How did you decide to do this? And did it influence your scholarship at all?
Yes, is the short answer. So I ended up in the Yukon because when I was finishing high school, I didn't have a sense of what I wanted to study in college, and it's 4 fairly expensive years of your life. And my parents, bless them, kind of were okay with me taking a gap year, which at the time was not all that institutionalized. My students now, I have a sense that there are kind of these programs and they set you up. I was not on such a thing. I had sort of a shoestring budget and a kind of a set of contacts that I got to this really ad hoc internship organization in Massachusetts. And one of the places on their list of, organizations or people that would take in folks with a high school diploma and not much else was this host family in the Yukon who needed help with their sled dog team. So my plan was to go there, and then I was going to go to Costa Rica, and then I was going to go to some other places. I've still never been to Costa Rica because I ended up staying for several years. And it absolutely influenced my scholarship. I don't think without that I wouldn't have been thinking about the Arctic, and I don't think I would have been thinking about the Arctic in the same way. And in some ways, I didn't even realize the degree to which it influenced me until I'd finished this first book.
So I'm curious about like the idea that sled dog musher families are just like advertising for like people to come like that. So that's like a thing that happens.
It is a thing that happens. So it's called being a dog handler.
Okay.
Which is kind of a fancy way of saying apprentice. And it's how most people learn how to mush, is that you are given room and board usually, but not usually a wage. But you're kind of trained by an experienced musher how to do it, because there isn't like mushing school. Maybe there is now, but most of the mushers that I know have learned it through, kind of spending some time doing really hard labor for another musher, and learning how to take care of the dogs, learning how to work with them, how to train them, having the dogs train you.
Wow.
And stuff like that. Okay.
Yeah, if you ever see like a real break from academia, like a full stop break.
Go dog mushing.
I mean, so I worked in a jewelry store, I was in graduate school, and that was a total break from academia because it was like restocking things and telling women they look beautiful and different, earrings and stuff like that. But I mean, this is on a whole nother level. So
yeah.
It also gives you really good perspective, because like it's a job where if things go wrong, the possibilities are somewhere between maiming and death. And in my life as a history professor, those aren't usually the
those aren't the stakes. Maybe you're not teaching correctly.
Those aren't the stakes. So. Yeah, that's maybe I'm not teaching correctly.
Yeah.
So you became a sled dog musher, and then I'm assuming you went to college. You came to Berkeley. When you were at Berkeley, how did you decide to come about to study the Bering Strait, and why do you end up calling it the floating coast?
Those are great questions. So I ended up at Berkeley because my husband and I did the Peace Corps after college, and we ended up in Moldova, so in a former Soviet satellite, and I was instantly really fascinated by the ways in which the kind of experience that people in Moldova had of the Soviet Union felt really analogous to me, to the experience that the indigenous folks I knew in the Arctic had. Like it had this kind of colonial feel to it. And at the same time, it was completely different, right? Like the built environment is different. The goals of the state are, kind of different. And so I realized that if I was interested in socialism and kind of the socialist model of development, and I was interested in the Arctic because that had never gone away, I should probably study Russia, because there's a lot of both. I was fortunate where I was in Peace Corps. I was trained in Romanian, but I lived in a community where there were many Russian speakers. So I started learning Russian. I had never taken a Russian history class in my life. and for reasons that remain mysterious, Yuri Sloskin, who's now retired from the Berkeley faculty, but was the Russian historian for a long time, took me on as his student. And I had no idea that environmental history was a field. So there's a theme of me being a little late to the jump here. So I read a book in my first year of grad school by Don Worster and was like, oh, yes! I see. I could be doing that. And then discovered I was at Berkeley that has no environmental historian on the faculty. So I wrote the book kind of in conversation with American historians and Russian historians on my committee in the first iteration as a dissertation. The title comes, so I'm really bad at titling things. I shouldn't be allowed to do it. I was good at titling my chapters, but I failed many times according to my editor and my agent at titling, because it just felt very pressured. And so this was actually one of the chapter titles, and I called it that because between what is now Russia and Alaska, every year the kind of the coastline closes in with sea ice. So it's a coast, but it's kind of hovering over the seafloor because it's usually not frozen to the bottom. And so the idea is that the coastline kind of connects there at the Bering Strait every year in this floating form.
Yeah, I think people who are good with titles, both of books and of articles, paper presentations, and stuff like that's a real skill that eludes most academics. Like my first monograph, I remember sending a chapter off to a friend who was looking at it, and he said, "Oh, this is a great line in this chapter. That should be the title of the book." It's like, yeah, that actually should be the title of the book. So I'm going to use that as the title of the book. I never thought of that, but anyway, yeah. I had a question, actually about one of the things that people have kind of mentioned repeatedly, both in reviews and in these awards and stuff like that, is about the narrative, is about the kind of voice that you've adopted. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the craft of writing, because obviously, as you know, as Varsha knows, as I'm sure most of our viewers know, academic books are supposed to be dry. Right? They're supposed to be boring. They're supposed to not be really engaging. And that's something that obviously a lot of historians and other academics are trying to really break out of. I think it's in some ways an unfair characterization. But so was there a specific process that you adopted? How did you kind of find the voice that kind of carried you through the book?
Yeah, so I when I was thinking about grad school, I was really torn between applying to history programs and anthropology programs. And my choice of history actually was because I kind of looked at the historians I had read. It was like, this is a discipline that will tolerate good writing, right? It's not necessarily one where you're trained in good writing, but it's not one where the boundaries of the discipline require a sort of writing that just is not going to be accessible to a wide readership. And I think historians have the advantage that you can write in a really broad range of tones and for very different kinds of audiences and still be legible within your home field. So I came to the kind of grad school part of things even really interested in writing. And in part it was because I had this long-standing relationship with the Arctic and with people in Arctic communities. And by the time I went to grad school, it was not just kind of a theoretical idea that climate change was transforming this part of the world that I loved very much and still do, but it was already happening and in really kind of dramatic, unavoidable, often really uncanny ways. And I felt an obligation and a responsibility to tell this story to as many people as I could, and to not, to have it do some sort of service in the world, because in many ways it's a prehistory of the place before climate change starts to transform it. And it's a history of the ideas that get us to climate change in many ways, even though it's not directly a book about climate change. And as I was writing it, I became very aware that for many people, there's this kind of bifurcated view of the Arctic, which is that for a long, long time, it was unchanging and nothing happened there. And then suddenly there was climate change and everything is happening very quickly, which actually, of course, erases the experience of being a person living in the Arctic or being a whale or being a reindeer. So I started to think of it as actually kind of being a necessary piece, coming along with that of some other scholars and saying, the Arctic has actually been a long-term place of change that the change is often driven by kind of colonial politics, and we should take those into account when we're thinking about what's happening now. So all of that was kind of in my mind as I thought about how to write it. And because I was writing an environmental history for a dissertation committee who had no members in the field, and half in Russia and half in the United States. So from the very beginning, I needed to have passages that explained why the New Deal was interesting so that Yuri Sloskin would understand why I was going on about it. And I needed to have passages about, the Russian Revolution so that Brian DeLay could understand them and know what I was yammering on about. And so that actually from the very beginning, like even in the bare bones dissertation draft, put a requirement that it reach a fairly broad audience, just because there was not one kind of national historiography that I could assume that everybody knew. And I think that also kind of shaped it from the beginning.
Yeah, I'm finding that as a motivator and maybe a little bit of an obstacle, but also a motivator for my dissertation, because my dissertation is like across 3 countries, and I have like 3 different historians in like 3 different country fields on my committee. So yeah,
I think
get it.
That's really interesting, because I think a lot of academics, when they're writing articles, books, or whatever, is that the audience that they're thinking of is other specialists in the field. But Bathsheba, as you were just kind of talking about, is you were thinking about multiple audiences, like necessarily as you were writing about your dissertation. And I think that's really useful. Like as somebody who's kind of trying to finish a trade book right now, is thinking about like who's going to pick this up. It's not going to be the guy who knows the charters of Philip I or something like that. It's going to be people who don't even know who Philip I is. So like, I need to do that kind of work to make sure it's clear to them.
Yeah. And I think to me, that's the place where if you teach people, we do that all the time, right? Yeah. We just don't necessarily do it in writing.
Yeah. So I have a specific environmental historiography question. Mainly, there's still not really an environmental historian on staff at Berkeley. And so when I was starting to learn about this stuff, one of the things that really got me interested is Richard White's The Organic Machine. And so you talk a lot in your book about this idea that's present in Western societies, like in Enlightenment thinking, as well as in socialist thinking, that humankind needs to sort of dominate nature, but that's not really possible in Beringia, right, where you study. And so what role do these states sort of play in your environmental history? Like, do they sort of recognize this, or is your environment a built environment, or is it trying to go back to this natural environment? How do you sort of talk about the environment, and what role do states play?
So first of all, Richard White was also very you can see some Richard White DNA in this project, just because of the interest in energy. To me, the role that states play, I expected when I began the book for states to actually be kind of the central story in many ways, because I saw Beringia as a place where you could sort of put the Soviet style socialism and American style capitalism next to each other and just kind of see what they look like and do, because you have this similar ecological space and very different kind of economic and social forms. But the story, as I kind of was working in the archives, ends up being one where non-state market forces actually kick it off, right? It starts with the commercial whaling in the 19th century, the good old, Moby Dick style tall ship whaling, which is not where I anticipated starting the book at all. I thought I was going to start in the 20th century. And so it's actually, in some ways, at the beginning, it's a story of the states catching up to what a market that exists outside of a state is doing. And then kind of by the 20th century, you have these sort of more familiarly high modernist projects that are trying to say, okay, if capitalism is universal, then it has to work in the Arctic. And what is that going to look like? And the Soviet Union is saying that really explicitly. Like, if we can make socialism in Chukotka, we can make socialism everywhere. And so that's where it becomes kind of a really state-driven project. And to me, one of the interesting things about the far north is that it's, even in Alaska, where people will kind of grumble about the state, it's always there if you need to do large-scale projects. And So it actually ends up being a major player, and a player that is repeatedly thwarted at the kind of job of conquering that it sets out for itself.
So I'm wondering too if you could talk a little bit about, one of the things that, so this is a little bit of a change of direction, but it was kind of going back and trying to connect a couple of things that you've mentioned here, is thinking about the area of the Bering Strait, about environmental history and kind of the history of colonialism as well, because those are things that, at least as someone who's not involved in kind of either of those fields, and also kind of a simple medievalist, so like it's all the old timey stuff way back when, like it's not something that I necessarily connect. But is this a common connection? Is it something that you think you were kind of doing that was different? Like how did you bring these kind of things together?
So I think that, first of all, I'm very impressed that you're a medievalist. I don't think it's old timey. The languages you have to know are like awe-inspiring. In terms of kind of the relationship between environmental history and histories of colonization, and I think that those two actually often go together, and particularly because in the United States, where kind of the focus of a lot of early environmental history scholarship was in the US and in the US West, the kind of specter of American colonization on the Great Plains and West is really a piece of some of that early work. So it's in, Bill Cronin's Nature's Metropolis is like an immediate kind of post-colonial story, right? It's like after what becomes Chicago is seized from Native people. Richard White, begins Organic Machine with indigenous fishing on the Columbia. So I think in the U.S., there is an association, although I think environmental history and Native American and indigenous history have kind of they're actually not often integrated, I would say.
Except for William Cronin and changes in the land and like stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. So, and I think that there's work coming out now that really is like, I think that there's kind of a generational shift. And I think part of that is that the interest of many environmental historians, myself included, has been in kind of 20th century capitalism. And that there's a tendency to kind of move that to a more kind of broad scale political register, or, in the vein of Don, sort of look at sort of the mega projects. And that there's kind of a turn now to thinking that, of course, Native people are involved in all of those things too. Like, just because you're in the 20th century, don't stop paying attention to that, which is very, very clear in the part of Alaska I look at, but I think is becoming more clear throughout the field.
Wait, so when you were writing this book, or when you're writing the dissertation, did you have an idea going in exactly what archives you were looking at, or did you like surprise yourself and find new archives you never expected? Or yeah
I wish I could say that I had a perfectly laid out plan. I wrote some grants that made it look like I had a really perfectly laid out plan. So
the lies we tell on grants, man, like
speculative fiction. That's
right.
Yeah.
So in the speculative fiction version, where this book started in 1917, things looked a little different. So I did basically a year of research in the US and in the National Archives in College Park, and in Washington, D.C. at the BIA archive, and in Anchorage, which at the time is where the kind of regional branch of the National Archives was, and then a couple different smaller archives in Alaska, and then also in all of the NARA things have moved around since then. So what was at the time in San Bruno, which was the only convenient archive if you were in Berkeley, and then started basically replicating that in Russia. So doing the kind of big national level collections in Moscow, and then the regional one in Vladivostok, and then planned to go up to Chukotka for the really kind of close to the ground version of things. And when I was in Vladivostok, I came to the both sort of great and horrifying realization that the story needed to start in the 19th century, and that the 19th century piece, those archives were in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Nantucket, and places that were not remotely on my list. I hadn't been thinking about them at all. And also that I needed to go to this town called Magadan in the Russian Far East, which had been the head of the Gulag administration during the Soviet period, because I also came to the realization that I couldn't avoid the Gulag much as I didn't really want to write about it when I started off, that it turned out to be a big piece of the mining history. So I had to add a bunch of archives as I was going, which I think is pretty, I mean, I'm sure there's a historian out there who has this perfectly laid plan. I'm pretty sure that's never going to be me.
We're showing up. We're showing up at that historian's door with pitchforks and fire, because I'm in the same position. I understand. Yeah.
Just adapt to the fact that you learn things, and you're like, oh, it turns out this, the collection that I thought was in Vladivostok is in Magadan. So you go to Magadan.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, that's a critical thing that we've talked about several times on here is you follow the sources, right? Is that they take you in unexpected places because you go in looking, thinking they're going to say one thing, and then they end up saying something totally different, or you find something else in the archive, that, and this is why, as we've talked about again several times, archivists are our best friends, right? Is that they put these things together, they know what's actually there. Like, we kind of pretend we know what's actually there, but they actually know what's kind of where the sources are and what's available. So
that's a thing that I have learned with my second project, is to be so much more frank with the archivists about what I don't know. I think as the grad student, I was really worried about looking like an idiot. And now I'm like, it's fine. I really don't know.
Right.
Just tell me.
Yeah. I realized this at my first trip to the NARA archives too, literally the summer after I started grad school. I went in pretending that I knew everything. And 2 minutes later, the archivist was like, you clearly have not done your work. And I was like, but I did. And she's like, no, you didn't. Here is a whole list of things you should first start off with. And it was amazing. It was great. Yeah.
I think humility is really important. It's
really
an important, really important. Yeah. So I was wondering too, if you could talk maybe a little bit about this. You mentioned this, the project you're working on now. What are the kind of the contours of it? What are you thinking?
So I'm mostly thinking at this point, because I haven't been able to get into an archive for 15 months.
I've heard there's this thing called the coronavirus that's going around. So
a little pesky.
Yeah.
I was in Alaska actually when it was starting to creep, and was like, you know what? I need to come home.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get stuck somewhere. But the eventual book that I'm in, what still feels like the very early days of, is about the Yukon River watershed. So the Yukon kind of ends in the Bering Sea. It's in some ways, it's like at the mouth of the Yukon is at the very southern limit of anything I talked about in the first book. But then it goes inland for almost 1,500 miles, and kind of has roots or tributaries, headwaters in the Canadian Yukon and in British Columbia. And I'm interested in part because when I lived in the Arctic the first time, I lived on one of the Yukon's tributaries, and have always wanted to sort of be able to go back there. And then after I wrote this book, my host father, who I'm still in touch with and see whenever I can, he was like, could you do this for here? I get the message. And also because one of the things that I kept kind of coming across in the writing of this book, and was around the edges of it, were the ways in which legal definitions of personhood and the capacity to bear rights, to own property, to make something property, to be a rights holder in a legal sense, were kind of always around the edges, right? Whose land is being taken? What is an animal? Who's a voter? But a book can only do so many things. So it's sort of like, okay, this thing about rights is kind of at the back of my mind. And the Yukon, because it goes through, it has such a long watershed, goes through several really distinct Indigenous kind of ways of thinking about rights. That's not even the right word in many cases, but of understanding how it is that you bring non-human beings into your political community in some way, and consider them part of the social space. And then the Russian and the British empires meet along the Yukon in the 19th century, and they have very different ways of understanding who has rights, what has rights, how are they given out. And some of them have to do with, what St. Petersburg is saying, and some of them have to do with the fact that they're really far from St. Petersburg, and the same thing with the British. And then now the watershed is divided between the US and Canadian states, which, although they, kind of share a legal DNA and that they're both, British common law descendants, actually have different ways of answering this that I think are interesting, particularly because they're both countries that are trying to kind of manage capitalism, but have chosen slightly different ways of doing that. But they also share a watershed that doesn't care about the borders. It doesn't care about how you're choosing to manage it. The salmon cut across, the caribou cut across, the water itself, you know, if somebody in Canada is polluting it, it ends up downstream. So it also has this kind of transnational set of problems in the 20th century. So that's where the thinking is. Where the sources are a whole other question. I have a lot of, I'm on leave in 2022 the whole year, so I will hopefully be able to fill in some, not some gaps, the entirety of gap.
Before we get to audience questions, I'm a huge water rights nerd. It's like my side gig, mainly because I really like writing about Native American water rights in the American West. So my question was, I know you haven't been able to start yet, but are you interested in bringing in like legal history, specifically the legal traditions of Russia and the Soviet Union versus Canada versus the United States versus Native Americans? Because I'm assuming all the First Nations that try to make their lives along the Yukon have different ideas about prior appropriation and water rights and riparian rights compared to their colonial states.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of what interests me, is that it's a place where you see all these rights traditions. In some ways, they're all operative, right? The Russian version is the least present now, the kind of Russian imperial version in the 19th century, because Russia sold their stake in Alaska to the United States. But you know, the ways in which land claims are operating on the Canadian side of the border, how Canada is figuring out how to negotiate and think about legal title. I mean, there's a move in Canada to actually kind of rethink how it is that rights are constituted, to take into account the fact that, you know, Indigenous societies have legal traditions and have ways of thinking about this that have been ignored by the state, and are increasingly kind of on the table to not be ignored anymore. And in the United States, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which is the kind of major piece of legislation in the 70s that extinguishes native title, basically because the United States finally decides that it needs to deal with Alaska because they want to drill oil, is also ongoing, right? The UNCSA cases are not all settled. I mean, in many parts of the United States, right, native law is a very active and ongoing and kind of fascinating thing. And in Alaska, you know, UNCSA was settled 50 years ago. So it's, you know, the people who kind of negotiated it are still alive and looking at the results, and trying to figure out kind of if it's working for what, you know, Indigenous nations wanted. So yeah, I think that's part of what is interesting to me. It's really intimidating because there's not like a legal history of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. There's just the BIA archive that has like one guy who sometimes answers your email about like if you could ever get in to look at the documents, which is probably why there's no like comprehensive legal history of it. But I'm hoping that by kind of focusing the interest not on everything that UNCSA has done or everything that the land claims movement in the Canadian territories has done, but think about it specifically in terms of how do these changes alter the ways that people are able to interact with the places that they live? Like what are the environmental impacts of the ways that you think about rights, essentially?
I want to shift. Like we're after the half hour now, so please, if you're watching, like please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be happy if we have time to ask them of Bathsheba. One of the ones that has is, you know, shifting gears perhaps a little bit, is that I think that the popular conception of environmental history is a history of the landscape, right? But I think that what's often involved there, and as you show so elegantly, you know, in your own work, is that it involves like living beings, and not just people, but animals as well. And so Mark, with a question after my own heart, is if he wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the bowhead whales and kind of the role that they play, you know, in the Bering Strait, and kind of how we understand the history of this place in this period. So.
I mean, I will take any possible opportunity to talk about both whales. So thank you for this question. So when I started working on this project, A, I didn't think I was going to write about the 19th century, and B, I didn't think I was going to write about whales. And it was one of the happiest things to have stumbled into, in part because one of the things that environmental historians invoke all the time is, being able to kind of document the ways in which the nature that humans interact with all the time is not just a static thing that we glom onto and change, but actually is incredibly dynamic. And the word agency comes up a lot, right? And the word agency is really complicated. It's complicated in social history. It's complicated if you apply it to things that aren't people. But the case of the bowhead whales is one where the kind of looking at the archival sources makes it pretty easy to make an argument about agency. They're extremely intelligent animals. They live for a couple of centuries. They communicate with each other. Marine biologists talk about them having culture and use that word very deliberately. Like these are animals that are capable of learning from each other in real time through communication, not through genetic adaptation. And in the sources that I was reading, it was pretty clear that bowhead whales had, tolerated and or actively participated in being hunted by native peoples for thousands of years, and that this was a key anchor point to native societies all along the Bering Strait. And the understanding by Indigenous hunters is that the whales have their own their own country, their own set of moral codes, and are observing people and judge people. And if people kind of disobey, step outside, don't pay attention, are bad to each other in various ways, the whales will not come close enough to human settlements to be hunted.
Whoa.
So the agency on whether or not you're able to actually kill the whale that is necessary to keep your communities alive is on you, but in a moral sense, not in a I'm conquering nature sense, right? The choice to be killed is that of the whale. And there are really careful descriptions of this in stories going way back and in how native hunters approach bowheads today. And so I had known this from the oral history sources and hearing people talk about it. And then I was looking at these 19th century logbooks by the commercial whalers who arrive in the Bering Strait. And when they get there in 1848, the bowhead hunting is unbelievably easy. I mean, they talk about running into the whales practically, right? They can just pick them off. It's not a problem. They basically give themselves over. So it's just a bonanza into the early 1850s. And then all of a sudden the whales change what they're doing completely. And they start fleeing from the tall ships. They have a whole set of adaptations, one of which is using the sea ice essentially as a barrier. So they'll see the ships and they'll go into the sea ice, having learned that if you're in a wooden ship, you don't want to go too close to the edge of the pack ice. And so the kind of marine biology side of things allowed me to argue, these are animals with culture. What I'm seeing in the records is very likely exactly what was happening. The whales were learning about the danger of these ships and they're changing their adaptations. And then the piece that I kind of smuggle in, and some readers get it and some readers don't, is that sort of based on the Indigenous way of understanding whale behavior and sentience and moral judgment, I kind of argue around the edge that, the whales were actually saying, I'm not going to die for this kind of hunter, right? I'm not going to die for the market, because there's no evidence that native hunting went down in the 1850s. And of course, there's other ways of explaining that. But to me, I chose the most conservative possible method of interpretation, which is the one that rhymes with the way that people who have observed these animals for the longest would make. So
that is so cool. Okay, because I've encountered fish and stuff in my stories, but the idea that whales have their own culture, I finally understand why Ishmael is so pissed off in Moby Dick. I can't get through that book. I've only gotten through a couple chapters, but I get it now. I was that
yes.
Makes a lot of sense.
The happiest nerd thing to ever happen to me is that there's a marine biologist who is extremely influential to my interpretation of whale behavior. His name's Hal Whitehead, which is the best name for somebody. And he is exactly the person that you imagine is called Hal Whitehead and studies whales. University captain. And he and I were on a panel together a couple of years ago, and he heard me talking about kind of bowheads changing their behavior. And he's like, well, he works with sperm whales mostly. He's like, well, I wonder if sperm whales did this. They were hunted in the same period. And so he published an article a couple months ago where he went and did a quantitative analysis of sperm whale behavior and could basically proved that the pods of sperm whales were communicating with each other and were learning ways of evading ships in the same period. So that's my happiest geek moment that has ever happened.
Oh my God, whales are so cool.
They're very cool. Yeah.
And so I'm assuming you didn't go into this project thinking that you were going to be talking about whales ever. Wow.
Not ever. No, I was sitting in Vladivostok, actually, in the coldest archive in the world, and I was like, this story starts with whales, and I don't know anything about and I don't know anything about like New Bedford in the 1850s. Yeah.
Did you ever get to see a whale when you were visiting the Arctic? That's so cool.
I was up there 3 years ago on the Russian side, and something happened with I was supposed to fly to this town called Providinya, which is right on the coast, and something mysterious and very Russian happened with the flight that I was supposed to be on. It was it's a whole mess. And in order to work in Chukotka as an American, you need a lot of permissions from, you need permissions from the local border guards, you need permissions from the local governor, you need permissions from the FSB detachment in Chukotka and the FSB in Moscow. It's a whole mess. So I have a fixer who like sets up my papers for me because I can't do it on my own. And so he came up with this plan where I could fly to his village, which is, 300 miles away from Providinya. And then I could take a ship overnight down the coast, basically a freighter, hauling goods. And then I would get to Providinya just a day later than planned. So I ended up on this, ship off the coast of the Russian side of the Bering Strait. And there was whales everywhere. It was great.
Wow.
I mean, I was terribly seasick, but the whales were spectacular.
Your project is like an adventure story on its own. Like, yeah.
That's bizarre.
Yeah. So there's a really cool question from Brendan. He was asking, did post-colonial theory at all influence how you thought about Indigenous people when you were writing about them in your book?
So that's a great question. And the answer is in a formal sense, it didn't. I was trained, as a really traditional Russian historian, and Russian history is not really deeply into post-colonial theory.
Really?
And, in the US history I was taking was not deeply seeped in it either. I mean, it was really the historiography. But the first way that I learned how to think about the histories of the Arctic were from Native people in the Arctic. And that's where I always started in terms of sources. So it wasn't a theoretical approach. It was just this is obviously where the story should begin. This should be my first brush with the material, should come through the people who have been writing histories from this place. And I didn't realize until later that might have not been the way that, in some ways it was not the way that I was taught to do it. But it was the only way that made any sense to me. And in terms of kind of the theoretical position, I think my experience living in the North made me take very seriously that the ideas you import from down South just don't work. You should think really, and I didn't learn that at a theoretical level. It wasn't at a don't bring your ideas here. It was at a very practical level. Like the way that I thought that the world worked when I was 18 and showed up, turned out that they didn't apply. And I think it has made me think really seriously that, these projects have to start from the people who know them the best, and then work outward.
Did you ever have to use oral history, or did you ever get a chance to use oral history or conduct interviews when you were on your research?
So I use a lot of oral histories that were done by the communities themselves for the most part.
Cool.
And I did that pretty deliberately. When I started off, I thought, oh, I will go, visit all these places and I will do oral history. And then I realized that methodologically, there was a real problem because, unless I had 40 years to write this book, I couldn't spend enough time in any one of these community. I would need to do this for dozens of places, need to spend lots of time in each of them in order to not just be like taking the version of things from the first person who's willing to talk to me and then getting out of town, right? And that did not seem like a responsible or accurate or ethical way to conduct things. And fortunately, many, if not most of the communities along the strait, both in Russian and English, have, they've been taking their own oral histories for a long time, right? And they're often bilingual. So there, be a Yupik and Russian version next to each other, or a, an Upyok and English version next to each other. And to me, those were sources where the community had sort of given the go-ahead that this is a public-facing version of their history. And I'm not, speaking of things that are not mine to say. And I, even in some cases in the archives, I would, was working in the collections of anthropologists or people like that, and sometimes was like, this is not material that's mine to publish, right? This person happened to have it in their field notes and I can read those field notes, but that doesn't mean that the details of this particular ceremony are actually mine to talk about. That can just stay there. So that's kind of how I worked with I was really grateful to the fact that there are these amazing oral history projects, and that hopefully the footnotes lead people to them.
So how do you like, can you talk a little bit about like the way that you negotiate the archive? Because I mean, like, this is a really interesting point, right? Is that oftentimes I think people think that you follow the sources, you publish what's there, you have a duty to kind of bring these things to light, but you're talking about, like, what you're really talking about is ethics. It seems like, right? Is like there's an ethical question about, like, is this mine to as a scholar to say something about, or is this somebody else's? So, and that's I think something that maybe not a lot of historians think about, but also certainly the general public doesn't think about. Like, but it is something that we deal with, I think, quite a bit. So, how do you kind of negotiate that?
Yeah, I thought in the case of this project and in the case of the one I'm working on now, that where I feel the responsibility is actually explaining what the intellectual traditions that actually are my patrimony, right? Like, that I come from. What is it that they do when they're exported to these places and when they're exported with state power behind them?
Yeah.
And that means taking really seriously what exists there outside of those state spaces, right? And understanding that that is a rich and vibrant and full world. But not that it is my duty to, explicate every detail of people's religious lives or personal lives, or I think even in the cases of colonization, that there are some aspects of the really traumatic pieces of that history that I am not in the position to tell correctly, or are not mine to tell in detail, right? That in fact, that could be more harmful than helpful. And, I have been helped by just being able to talk with people about it, right? Like, is it is it helpful to be able to, like, write a history where you put the Russian and American sides together? If you're kind of thinking about these two states as having assimilative projects that are similar to each other, if you're kind of bringing in the context that assimilation is not just about kind of taking people away from a set of relationships with their land, but also transforming the land itself, like kind of redoing the ecology. And that all seems like something that's in my wheelhouse. But I don't know, I think sometimes historians, we get this kind of acquisitive feeling when you're in the archives and you're like, oh, I could add this and it'd be great. And I have learned to be kind of suspicious of that. Like, sometimes you really need to know that, and sometimes you need to know it and then you need to let it go, because it doesn't, someone else can tell it better than I can. And that's why it's great that we're in a community of scholars, right? It's not like one person has to write the book that ends this story. That would be awful. You want your work to be in dialogue with people. You want it to be a piece of a conversation where you have access to something, but other people can fill it out in other ways.
So I have to know, because again, I am an environmental history nerd. Do you get to teach environmental history at Brown, or have you taught a class on it yet?
I do. That's what I am now.
That's so cool. Okay.
I was hired as an environmental historian, despite my strange background. Yes, and I have a dual appointment in environmental studies and history. So.
Oh, great.
So now that you get to teach it, besides William Cronin and Don Worster, who are your favorite environmental historians to teach?
That's a great question. So right now I'm teaching this big global environmental history class that starts with Columbus and goes to the present. And we're somehow, I'm teaching this summer also due to weird reasons having to do with COVID. So we're trying to do all of this in like 12 and a half weeks, which is absurd.
Yeah.
But some work that I've really enjoyed teaching so far, like we're kind of at the end of the 1600s now. Marcy Norton's work, she has an article in the HR called The Chicken and the Iegue, which is wonderful. My students loved it. It's about kind of different ideas of what is domestic and kind of what are the kinds of relationships that people can have with animals that they live in close proximity with, and contrasting sort of Spanish colonial ideas and indigenous ideas from kind of Mesoamerica. Judith Carney's book, Black Rice, which is about she's a geographer, but she talks about the ways in which particularly women's rice growing technologies in West Africa are imported to the Carolinas through the transatlantic slave trade. It's a really interesting kind of discussion of the power dynamics and the gender dynamics and the just kind of how you transform landscapes with rice. Later on, I really like teaching Kate Brown's work, her book Plutopia, which is about nuclear disasters or nuclear towns in the United States and the Soviet Union. Kate's like the other person who does comparative stuff. We end up on panels all the time. But it makes some really interesting points about the ways in which nuclear technology kind of makes the Soviet Union and the United States look really similar to each other. And students really get into that. Let's see, who else? There's a long list. It's hard to narrow it down.
Well, can I ask you a slightly different question instead of academics? Is like, do you teach with pop culture at all? Like, are there like movies, TV shows, like portrayals, like the idea of Alaska? Like, it is something that seems to kind of animate the kind of popular imagination, right? Like this frontier. It's cold, it's dark, it's desolate, it's kind of weird, it's kind of other in some kind of fundamental way. Like, so are there things that kind of evoke it really well, or are there, as foils, like things that really do a terrible job that you can kind of use in a pedagogical sense? So
yes, so I don't teach it. So this global history just moves so fast that we're basically like constantly treading through 75 years at a lecture or something ridiculous. I teach a seminar on Arctic history that has a lot more space for that, and has a lot more kind of fun popular culture. And I've started teaching that where we start by watching some of the Discovery Channel's truly amazing, and I mean amazing in like the kind of, it inspires awe, but not necessarily in a good way. They have a show called Gold Diggers. They have a couple like reality TV about living in Alaska and, you know, panning gold, that just leans so hard into every kind of myth about the American frontier, about like how you make wealth in a capitalist economy. And so we watch a couple of those and then basically spend the rest of the semester kind of putting it in historical perspective and understanding that this whole idea has a very particular past. And students really get into that as a sort of opening act that we're watching this somewhat ridiculous show, but it's also compelling, right? Like there's a reason it's on television. And moving through, you know, so many students now have watched various iterations of kind of dog sledding movies, the Balto and other things that Disney have put out in the last couple of years to sort of talk about, you know, how it is that these films that are very compelling, and I love a good dog story, also completely erase the fact that the mushing itself comes from Native peoples in Alaska and had to be taught to white settlers. It wasn't, you know, and in some cases it's kind of a fascinating hybrid kind of set of techniques that come from, you know, actually people from Russia bringing over technology that gets adapted. and that sort of disappears in these frontier stories. So there's a lot, basically.
Yeah.
And I think some of it too is the, like, many students come into a course in Arctic history because their understanding of the Arctic is basically like a polar bear on a tiny piece of salt. Right? And so
my idea of the Arctic is just the Klondike bar advertisement. Like I'm
Yes.
amazed. I'm wondering if the Klondike bar is going to come into your second book, because that would be really funny if it did.
That's true. I have to go to the Klondike. So
Excellent. So, one of the other questions that we had from the audience was about the region as a site of basically kind of like borderland, right? Is with different kind of peoples kind of mixing across these kind of regions and state borders, which modern thing people necessarily don't care about until very recently and things like that. But the question was actually about kind of more recently, is that immigration from places kind of other ways. He specifically mentions this guy, Gurdeep Fonder of the Yukon. And so I'm wondering, like, I have no idea what he's talking about, but like
I do.
What's going on? Like, how is this place, how is the Bering Strait, the region around it, like, how has that been, like, has it been kind of a place of connection across different peoples and times?
That's a great question, and I love that that Gundeep has become the phenomenon on the internet that he has. He's been posting these amazing
Bhangra dances,
like in snowbanks at minus 40 to keep people's spirits up during COVID. Actually, I think is started, and I think, to me, that's one of the things about the North that I think sometimes gets missed, is that while it is far from the kind of big population centers, just in terms of demographic numbers, it's a place that has for a very long time had really fascinating mixing going on. And that goes, the whaling ships in the 19th century, right? The crews on whaling ships came from absolutely everywhere. They were formerly enslaved people and native people from New England, along with, white Protestants from New England. And then they would pick people up in the Canary Islands, they'd pick people up in Hawaii. And so, from the very beginning, and you can see this actually in the names that sailors gave to various places that they were visiting. Like, some of the names are Hawaiian because the sailors were from Hawaii. And the kind of patois that people spoke in these whaling camps, some of it was Dutch, some of it was Swedish, some of it was English, some of it was Russian, some of it was Tagalog. It's like it has been a very kind of multi-ethnic space for a long time, I think, because of the ocean, right, which often kind of brings people. And now, Anchorage, Alaska is, I think, one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the United States.
Wow.
Which is not necessarily what you would guess of Anchorage, Alaska, but it's really, people come up for the fishing jobs and the oil jobs, and they come up because, Anchorage is actually interested in having people come in, so they're a little bit more welcoming to immigrants than some other red state cities might be. And the Yukon Canada has also had immigration policies that kind of support that in many ways. So the village that I lived in the Yukon for a long time, the person who kind of kept their finance department running was from Ghana. And I was always like, how? You were 80
How did you get here?
The Arctic Circle. Are you okay? The sun just doesn't even come out here for months and months. So yeah, it's and I think that's a place where there's like a whole kind of world of historical work that can be done.
I think that's a really good last question for me to end on. So you moved from, I'm assuming you lived in Massachusetts during high school, and then you moved to become a dog musher, and then you came to Berkeley for grad school, but now you're in Rhode Island. So when it comes to living in, like, weather, do you prefer the Berkeley weather or like Rhode Island / Yukon weather?
Oh, this is a good question. So I grew up in Iowa.
Oh, okay, Iowa, not Massachusetts.
So that did have some winter. I do not like the warm very much, but Berkeley doesn't get very hot. Berkeley is pretty good weather, although I don't envy you your forest fires now. Those mostly started after I graduated. But I really like the cold. So I'm pretty happy. I
Oh,
mean,
Rhode Island.
it would be terrible to like have long-standing connections with the far north if the cold was miserable.
I think people underestimate too. Like, and I say this as I'm not a native Midwesterner, but like the winters of the plains in the Midwest, like those are not to sleep on. Like, I mean, they can be absolutely brutal too. So
yeah, no, I mean, I had seen 40 below before I went to the Arctic. It doesn't get that cold really now anymore in Iowa, but when I was growing up, certainly. So not for as long. I mean, it doesn't happen for months on end, but.
Yes. So more sun at least, right, in Iowa during winter months. So yes. Yeah.
But the thing about the north is that, you have these months of darkness, but then, by the end of February, the twilights are incredibly long. So you actually have lots of daylight. It's a brief period where you're just really locked down and it's very dark and very cold. But I mean, end of February through end of April are wonderful times up there. So if you remember.
Well, on that note, everybody go to the Yukon. So it'll be amazing.
Everybody visit the Arctic, see the whales.
After you're vaccinated, yes.
After you're vaccinated.
That's right.
Yeah.
Canada is not letting us in yet from the US.
No. Yeah.
It's been a little while, but
it's a smart move. It's a smart move.
Smart move. I wouldn't trust Americans either. So anyway, on that note, unfortunately we are out of time. This has been a really wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Bathsheba, for joining us. You can find the link in the chat, but also for her new book on our bookshop page as well. So please go out and take a look at that. Again, it is a multi-award winning, a masterful, really wonderful narrative. So please go out and take a look at that. And thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be back next week. And until then, everybody, cheers.
Cheers. Thanks so much, Bathsheba.